Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. What do you call it when Vladimir Putin trades in threats of nuclear Armageddon for promises of nuclear power plants? A rebranding campaign, that's what. Less mushroom cloud, more cooling tower. Less duck and cover, more plug into the grid. Only this one comes with uranium rods instead of loyalty cards. For years, Vladimir Putin has relied on nuclear saber-rattling to intimidate the West, brandishing missiles, boasting about unstoppable warheads, and warning of catastrophic consequences. If anyone dares to cross him, that is. But now, suddenly, the Kremlin is humming a different tune. On this episode, we examine a curious shift in Moscow's playbook. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russia is rapidly expanding its influence in the global energy sector, with a growing number of countries turning to it for nuclear power solutions. Russia's state nuclear corporation Rosatom is leading the charge in building new nuclear power plants and modernizing existing ones. Russia's approach isn't just about building reactors. They offer comprehensive packages that include training local personnel, supplying nuclear fuel, and managing waste. Several countries are already deeply engaged in these partnerships. In Belarus, a new nuclear power plant is now operational, with reports showing it provides 40% of the country's electricity. The partnership is so strong that Belarus is now collaborating with Rosatom on projects in other countries. Armenia, which already relies on nuclear power for a third of its electricity, is working with Russia to extend the operational life of its current plant and is exploring new projects using small nuclear modules. This village in Kazakhstan will soon become the site of the country's first nuclear power plant. Rosatom will lead the construction in Kazakhstan, which is the world's largest producer of uranium. Meanwhile, Myanmar recently signed a package of documents with Russia for the construction of nuclear plants. The demand for nuclear energy is rising worldwide. Russia is keen to capitalize on this, even creating a new nuclear energy platform within the BRICS economic bloc to help finance these projects.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Rosatom, Russia's state-run nuclear corporation, has become a global leader in nuclear energy. Backed by Russian diplomacy, however, Rosatom is more than a company. It is a tool for projection of Moscow's power.
Rosatom, the Russia State Atomic Energy Corporation, stands as a key player in the global nuclear energy market. Emerging from the Soviet Ministry of Atomic Energy after the Chernobyl disaster, Rosatom was restructured in 2007 and now operates under direct control of the Russian president. Over the past 2 decades, Rosatom has expanded its international footprint, constructing dozens of reactor units and securing nearly half of all global nuclear energy contracts. What sets Rosatom apart is its one-stop nuclear shop model. It provides comprehensive packages from reactor construction and safety training to financing and fuel disposal. This approach has made nuclear energy accessible to emerging markets in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. Rosatom's strategic partnerships and global reach are backed by Russian diplomacy, allowing Moscow to leverage nuclear infrastructure for political influence.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. At the so-called Global Atomic Forum in Moscow, Putin declared that Russia was ready to share its nuclear energy expertise with the global South and East. Leaders from Ethiopia and Myanmar politely applauded. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Mariano Grossi, was also present, validating Putin's claim that Russia is leading in the peaceful use of nuclear energy. But let's be absolutely clear. This is not a peace offering. This is influence wrapped in reactor blueprints. By presenting Rosatom as a benevolent partner, Moscow is trying to forge long-term dependencies. Countries that take Russian technology will also need Russian fuel, Russian training, and when things inevitably break down, Russian servicing. Now, this soft rhetoric marks a contrast with Putin's private address just a month earlier at Sarov, Russia's nuclear research center. There, he bragged about new nuclear-powered drones and Russia's cutting-edge deterrence capabilities. The public message is all about peaceful atoms. The private message remains fear our arsenal. Now, the centerpiece of Putin's new approach is his proposal to extend some provisions of the New START Treaty, which limits US and Russian nuclear arsenals for just one more year beyond its 2026 expiration. Russian media trumpeted this as a breakthrough, a selfless gesture of restraint. Washington, predictably, wasn't impressed. Why? Because Putin's offer doesn't include data exchanges, inspections, or any of the confidence-building measures that made New START valuable in the first place. It's a hollow promise, a treaty extension in name only. Instead, Russia has shifted to symbolic gestures, but stopping just short of outright provocation. The goal here is ambiguity. By toning down the most aggressive signals, Putin can make himself look restrained, even reasonable, while continuing to exploit uncertainty. If he can frame himself as a responsible nuclear power while still harassing European airspace with conventional aircraft, he stands a chance of splitting the transatlantic alliance. But Putin's strategy has limits. For one, his nuclear diplomacy isn't attracting a great crowd. Ethiopia and Myanmar may show up at his atomic forum, but Turkey's President Erdogan, arguably Putin's most important partner in the nuclear energy game, chose to meet with Trump in Washington instead. Ankara has been drifting closer to NATO and even considering sanctions on Russia, despite relying on Moscow for energy. Putin's claim to be promoting peaceful energy is undercut by Lukashenko's announcement that new nuclear-capable missiles are on their way to Belarus. You can't talk about reactors for hospitals and universities while you're also stationing warheads on your neighbor's soil. So when Putin speaks of restraint, we should hear warning bells, because what he calls peaceful atoms are really just another tool in his arsenal, one designed not to destroy cities but to manipulate governments. If history is any guide, it's only a matter of time before the old Brinkmanship reappears, this time with renewed intensity. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nielsen, a lecturer of Slavic and East European Studies at University College London. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me.
So, looking at Russia's so-called nuclear diplomacy, are we entering a softer phase right now, with less intimidation and more attempts at trying to endear certain countries, especially in the global south, to Russia's offer in terms of nuclear power?
So I would argue that Russia's foreign policy across the world has always been multi-pronged, if you see what I mean. So you've always had both a hard power element and a softer power element. Now, you quite rightly highlight how Russia has particularly tried to push its nuclear diplomacy, for instance, and its soft power more generally in the global south. And we can certainly see that continuing, also because this is something Russia is actually capable of doing, whereas the projection of hard power is something Russia finds increasingly difficult.
So do you think that this is also because Russia is seeing that its influence in this regard in Europe is going to wane? I mean, there are still countries that are using Russian nuclear reactor technology, but the number of these countries is likely to diminish as time goes by. So it is clearly looking for more options outside of Europe, right?
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, when we're talking about the nuclear activity of Russia abroad, it obviously has an economic element as well as a political and, for that matter, an identity element. There is no doubt that Rosatom and the Russian state more broadly is looking for customers elsewhere. And certainly there are some customers in the global south, like, for instance, Egypt, like arguably Turkey, if you want to put them in the global south. There are definitely customers there that can pay quite well and are willing to pay quite well for Russian energy and for Russian buildings and so on.
But this business does actually come with strings attached, doesn't it?
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, what Rosatom, for instance, tends to do is it tends to come as a complete package. That's not always the case, but it's frequently the case. So you will have them turn up and be responsible for the entire operation, all the facets of, say, a nuclear power plant or the expansion of a nuclear power plant and so on. And of course, once that's the case, then the Russian side, Rosatom, has quite a lot of power, if you like, towards the host state. Not that Rosatom necessarily wants to play hardball with its influence, but it will, of course, stress to its buyers, particularly once the building of any nuclear power plant or the expansion of any nuclear power plant is taking place. Rosatom will definitely stress that it has to be kept in the loop, that it has to be kept in the decision-making processes in the energy policy of the host country. And if Rosatom has to be kept involved, then so does the Russian state, because those two are largely interchangeable.
Yeah, I mean, they are inseparable in this regard. Now, that's a very important point that you're making here, because this is pretty much a company that is under presidential supervision in Russia. So it doesn't get any closer to the political circles than that if you're, at least ostensibly, still a business and not a part of the state apparatus. So is this line really blurred here in a way?
Oh, I think it absolutely is. And whenever we are looking at Russia today and we're looking at Russian business today, if we're talking of about a company or an industry of a certain size, an energy industry would be a good example of that, then of course the Russian state is going to be involved completely, or at least in a dominant fashion. The only thing I would perhaps add to that is, if we look at it from a comparative point of view, particularly the nuclear industry across the world very often requires state input. Why is that the case? Well, because the nuclear industry, when you, for instance, build a nuclear power plant and so on, you do that over the long term, and you're normally only seeing a return on your investment over the long term. So quite frequently, you do need the state to go in and back up, either with credit guarantees and so on, or with specific expertise and upfront funds and so on. So although, of course, in Russia, this is even more so the case than it would be, say, in Western countries, having the state involved when we're dealing with nuclear power in particular is not that unusual on a global scale.
So what is unusual is that this company not only engages in strictly business ventures, but also, for example, operates a stolen nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, doesn't it?
Well, the whole Zaporizhia power plant is, of course, very much up in the news these days. So there is the issue of it being stolen, but there's also, as you and your viewers will know, the issue of safety around the Zaporizhia power plant. Now, obviously, if the situation around Zaporizhia were to deteriorate in the coming days and weeks, and although I don't think that's going to happen in a critical way, it could certainly be the case. I mean, it's too early to say that situation is safe. Then, of course, that will backfire certainly on Ukrainian security, but also on Russian image and on the idea of Russian expertise and responsibility. When we're talking about Russian responsibility, particularly when we're talking about nuclear energy, I would perhaps also point you and your viewers to a few of Rosatom's activities around the world. So, for instance, I'm looking at the power plant down by Akuyu in Turkey, which Rosatom is involved in building. Now, we know that a power plant like that is being built in an area of the world that could be prone to earthquakes. That may well come back to become a problem for such a power plant. And tellingly, it is not necessarily something Rosatom is willing to seriously consider. So I think Zaporizhia, you're absolutely right, of course, in highlighting that when we're talking about Russian nuclear energy activity abroad. But there are other places where Russia is involved where you might potentially see problems in future.
So now, the problems in the future are one thing, but there are also problems in the present. And one of them is that apparently Rosatom is making a killing when it comes to the sale of uranium, of all places, in the United States, even though it shouldn't be. But there are still loopholes that are being exploited by this company. This was revealed by Bloomberg recently. Why is that so? And don't you think it casts a certain shadow upon America's efforts to make Europe stop buying Russian oil and gas?
It absolutely does, but I mean, this goes into the entire context of the sanctions, how they work, whether they work, and so on and so forth. And we've seen tons of loopholes around the world. This, what you're describing now, certainly reflects badly on the United States, but a number of European countries have had to consider their position as well, both in terms of what the European states are doing, but also in terms of what European companies are doing. I think if we were to have a consistent sanctions policy, and now I'm talking not only about nuclear energy, but also about economic policy more generally from the West towards Russia, we would need much more coordination, not only between the United States and Western Europe, but also within Western Europe as such. I'm, for instance, here looking at the positions, say, of Hungary and Slovakia within the European Union. So I think you're absolutely, you're pointing your finger at a serious problem. I think this situation is gradually getting a bit better in terms of Western compliance and carrying out of serious sanctions, but we're certainly not there yet. I would agree with you completely.
It does take a while. I mean, the argument that is given by countries still buying this is that, okay, so we do not have any alternative sources of nuclear fuel, especially if Rosatom has actually made itself this one-stop shop, which is convenient if you want to buy from them, but very inconvenient if you want to get rid of them. And obviously also because Europe and the US are, or at least had been at some point, very sort of like, green energy minded, right? It was never something that you would put to your voters, at least for quite a while, that we want to build another uranium mine. We want to buy into that because you would immediately get a chorus of people saying, oh, nuclear energy, is not safe. It's actually something that we shouldn't be relying on. We need to really lean on heavier on the renewables instead, and so on. So isn't the West falling into its own trap of getting rid of its own industrial capacities for, extracting uranium, refining it, and making it, ready for use in nuclear power plants? Right now, it's paying the price.
No, you could absolutely be right in that. And that leads to the broader question that you were just hinting at about energy discussions within the West, broadly speaking. You can have arguments for and against nuclear energy. But something that's often been taken as a criticism of nuclear energy in the West, for instance, has been this lack of consistent thinking across the life cycle of a nuclear power plant. So also in terms of, for instance, the nuclear waste and so on. Now, all of these things can be solved, and they can be solved crucially without Russian assistance. But of course, a company like Rosatom and a state like the Russian have taken advantage of the fact that, say, in Western Europe, for instance, you have not had this joined-up thinking, historically speaking, in terms of energy governance. And therefore, say, if you were Hungary and the Hungarian government, and I think we can criticize the Hungarian government for many things in recent years, not least in regards to its relationship with Russia. But if you were the Hungarian government, you could perhaps reach out to the US, to Western Europe, and say, look, I understand you don't want us to buy, say, gas from Russia, fair enough, but we do need some level of energy. And if you don't want us to get nuclear expertise and nuclear energy with Russian help either, then what exactly are you suggesting? What exactly is the plan? And I think what you're highlighting as well now is that in the West, we need to have a long-term discussion, not only about the dangers from Russia, but also about how are we going to secure Western energy supplies in future. And if we do see a global climate crisis coming on, which we are, then how are we going to mitigate that in a way that does not jeopardize the specific energy security of individual customers? Now, gradually, slowly, you're beginning to have that discussion, certainly in Western Europe, less so perhaps in the United States. But we have a long way to go yet. And you're absolutely right. A country like Russia is trying to take advantage of that.
Rasmus Nilsson was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. The Russian parliament is considering a nationwide food stamp program. Lawmakers say it's a response to the country's worsening economic situation.
Russia could soon introduce food stamps for low-income citizens. The initiative comes from members of the so-called opposition parties, Fair Russia, the Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party. Under the proposal, families earning below the regional subsistence minimum, set at around 19,300 rubles per person, or roughly 185 euros, would receive food stamps worth 30% of that amount, approximately 55 euros. Lawmakers argue that similar programs are already working in several regions, including Moscow, Buryatia and Krasnoyarsk. They say more areas are adopting the system, but not all can afford it without federal support. According to Rosstat, Russia's official statistics agency, 8.1% of the population, so nearly 12 million people, lived below the poverty line in the first quarter of 2025. That is up from 7.2% the year before.
The Polish security services have uncovered a Russian sabotage plot. Explosives hidden in corn cans were meant to target Poland, Lithuania and Germany.
Poland's internal security agency exposed a Russian operation involving explosives hidden inside canned corn. The plan was supposedly part of a broader sabotage effort by Russian military intelligence aimed at destabilizing Ukraine's allies. Investigators say the explosives were smuggled across borders by a suspected courier from the Russian military intelligence agency GRU, who also transported drone parts and SIM cards. He allegedly received instructions to dig up the explosive cans buried in a Lithuanian cemetery and relocate them near Łódź, Poland. Prosecutors say the suspect could face life in prison, and they aim to wrap up the investigation by year's end. The American Institute for the Study of War recently warned that Russia and Belarus may carry out sabotage attacks in Poland and falsely blame Ukraine. This latest case appears to fit that pattern.
Telegram's founder has met Kazakhstan's president in Astana. The two discussed AI, cybersecurity and digital education.
President of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, sat down with Telegram founder Pavel Durov on Thursday at the Digital Bridge 2025 Tech Forum in Astana. The meeting focused on expanding cooperation in artificial intelligence, cybersecurity and education. Tokayev praised Telegram's role in advancing Kazakhstan's digital transformation. The company has officially joined the Astana Hub, opened a local office, and launched AI labs at the Alem.ai Center. Durov shared plans for future joint projects in AI, highlighting the potential for innovation in the region. During the forum, he announced the opening of a new AI lab in Kazakhstan during the forum's opening session.
For this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.